Over the last decade, immersive virtual reality has moved out of the realm of science fiction and directly into 21st century classrooms and corporate training centers. This chart visualizes an exponential spike in academic publications dedicated to learning with virtual reality over the last 40 years. Millions of dollars and countless hours have been invested into testing this hardware. Driving this investment is a widespread assumption among educators and instructional designers that maximizing a student's immersion and interactive freedom will automatically produce a superior educational outcome. Picture two learners. One manipulates a 3D simulation in a headset, while another passively watches a video recording of that exact same simulation. The experimental data reveals a highly counterintuitive reality. The student sitting passively at the desk and watching the video frequently retains more factual knowledge than the student fully immersed in the headset. High emotional engagement and intense novelty do not guarantee cognitive retention. Giving a learner total interactive freedom in a simulated environment can actively disrupt their ability to learn the material. To understand why VR creates this paradox, we have to look at a historic debate in educational psychology regarding what actually drives learning, the technological medium or the instructional design. In 1994, educational psychologist Richard Clark argued that media are mere vehicles that deliver instruction. By his logic, whether you use a chalkboard, like a television, or a VR headset, the hardware itself has zero influence on student achievement. This stood in direct opposition to media theorists like Marshall McLuhan, who famously insisted that a medium's underlying rules dictate how humans process information. The data on immersive technology resolves this debate by synthesizing both views. Media interacts with method. A VR headset does not magically create knowledge, but it does amplify specific instructional methods designed for its unique psychological traits. This interaction is mapped entirely by the cognitive affective model of immersive learning, or the CAMIL framework. To understand how to successfully teach a human being inside virtual reality, we have to trace the exact causal chain mapped by CAMIL, from the physical hardware on the face to the resulting changes in the brain. Modern head-mounted displays completely isolate the user. They shut out real-world visual and auditory cues, locking the user's sensory inputs into a closed loop. Looking at the CAMIL framework, the process begins strictly with the raw technical inputs provided by this hardware. These three dark blue nodes are objective technological metrics. Immersion is the sensory isolation. Control factors measure how accurately the system tracks physical movement. Representational fidelity is the graphical realism and the smoothness of the display. These hardware features do not contain educational value on their own. Their sole function is to generate two specific psychological affordances: presence and agency. Presence is the genuine illusion of being there in the simulated environment. Agency is the neurological feeling of generating and controlling actions within that environment. If an instructional design fails to trigger both presence and agency, the simulation will feel hollow. At that point, the hardware operates as nothing more than an expensive, heavy television monitor. When a system successfully convinces users they are physically and socially present in a space, it acts as a massive multiplier for emotional engagement. The CAMIL framework maps this positive output into 4 distinct affective mediators. The brain responds to novel, high-fidelity stimuli that it can autonomously control. This directly sparks situational interest and intrinsic motivation. The user actively wants to explore the environment.
Crucially, it triggers self-efficacy. Because the user is making choices and manipulating objects, VR converts passive, vicarious observation into the psychological feeling of a personal mastery experience. This leads to embodiment. When the hardware provides accurate, zero-latency motor tracking, it tricks the central nervous system into taking ownership of a virtual body. These 4 effective factors create the specific engagement often associated with the technology. They form an emotional drive that can make complex, immersive tasks feel both intuitive and compelling. But there is a severe penalty for total immersion. Walking into a complex virtual projection floods the brain with an immense volume of sensory data. If we return to the CAMIL framework, we find 2 hidden bottlenecks where this sensory flood actively degrades the learning process. The first bottleneck is extraneous cognitive load. This occurs when mental bandwidth is wasted processing irrelevant information, which quickly overwhelms the user's limited working memory. The psychological affordances of VR work against the user here. A massive 360-degree field of view and complete navigational freedom force the brain to waste intense cognitive energy just searching for the relevant instructional details. This triggers the second bottleneck, the suppression of self-regulation. Effective learning requires momentary decoupling from an activity to pause, reflect, and organize new information. The simulation is simply too engaging. The hedonic value, the pure fun of the environment, tempts learners to just play. They experience the novelty without ever engaging in deep cognitive processing. The exact same features that make virtual reality emotionally engaging simultaneously flood working memory and block the reflection required to actually learn. The final phase maps how psychological factors forge permanent knowledge. VR is inefficient for factual knowledge. High cognitive load interferes with memorization. By contrast, VR is effective for procedural knowledge. The medium's focus on behavior and physical repetition is its primary strength. By combining the illusion of embodiment with the confidence of self-efficacy, learners can physically rehearse a procedure endlessly. This strengthens realistic neural pathways, allowing the skill to seamlessly transfer out of the simulation and into the real world. Successful implementation requires treating immersive VR as a specialized behavioral simulator rather than a general-purpose educational tool. Its impact depends entirely on precise targeting. The final design challenge for educators is straightforward. We have to maintain the affective benefits of VR while artificially removing the cognitive bottlenecks. We achieve this through the pre-training principle. This requires teaching core concepts and terminology before the user ever puts on the headset, acting as a shield for their working memory. Establishing prior knowledge anchors gives the user a mental schema. When they enter the immersive environment, they can parse the sensory data efficiently, drastically reducing their extraneous load. We pair this with generative learning strategies, activities like enactment or summarization, applied immediately after the headset is removed. Because the simulation naturally suppresses reflection, these generative strategies artificially force the self-regulation necessary to cement the memory. Returning to the initial paradox, placing a student inside a simulation does not guarantee they will learn. The instructional methods wrapped around the simulation dictate whether the medium enhances the lesson or destroys it. We have to stop treating virtual reality as a magical learning vehicle. It is a high-load, high-presence medium. And it requires rigorous, medium-specific instructional scaffolding to translate engagement into actual cognition.